October 24, 1944, 0630 hours. Bridge of the Japanese heavy cruiser Myoko, Siboyan Sea, 350 nautical miles south of Manila. Commander Toshiro Nakamura pressed his binoculars against the salt-crusted windows, scanning the eastern horizon where his lookouts had reported distant aircraft. The morning sun backlit what appeared to be an impossibly dense formation of American planes, wave after wave climbing from beyond the curve of the earth. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for the intercom. In his 14 years with the Imperial Navy, he had studied every intelligence report on American carrier operations. He knew their doctrines, their launch procedures, their theoretical capabilities. The doctrine manuals sitting in his cabin specified that a fleet carrier required approximately 90 minutes to launch a full strike package of 80 aircraft, allowing for safe intervals between launches, proper formation assembly, and coordinated departure. What he was witnessing made no sense. The aircraft kept coming. Grumman Hellcats at high altitude, Curtiss Helldivers in loose formations, Grumman Avengers flying low with torpedoes visible beneath their fuselages. He began counting, lost track, started again. 40 aircraft, 60, 80, 100. They were still launching. From his training at Etajima Naval Academy, he knew this was impossible, yet the evidence filled the sky before him. What Commander Nakamura could not know was that 8 minutes earlier, at 0622, USS Lexington had begun launching her full strike package. What he could not comprehend was that the massive Essex-class carrier, displacing 36,000 tons fully loaded and stretching 872 feet from bow to stern, had perfected a launch system that reduced the time from first aircraft to last from 90 minutes to under 8 minutes for a full deck-load strike. What the Japanese officer witnessing this aerial armada truly could not grasp was that Lexington was just one of 14 Essex-class carriers now operating in the Pacific, and that each one could replicate this seemingly impossible feat multiple times per day. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The mathematics of carrier aviation had been established through decades of careful study by every major naval power. The Imperial Japanese Navy's carrier doctrine, refined through operations from Pearl Harbor to the Coral Sea, calculated that a fleet carrier with an air group of 70 to 80 aircraft required careful timing to prevent deck crashes, coordinate fighter escorts, and ensure proper formation before proceeding to target. The process was methodical and, the Japanese believed, universal. First, clear the flight deck of all aircraft being serviced. Second, bring strike aircraft from the hangar deck via elevator, a process requiring 4 to 6 minutes per elevator load. Third, position aircraft on deck with wings spread and locked. Fourth, conduct final pre-flight checks. Fifth, launch aircraft in sequence with 30 to 45-second intervals to prevent dangerous wake turbulence and allow safe climb out. The mathematics were simple. 80 aircraft at 45-second intervals meant 60 minutes of launches, plus the 30 minutes of deck preparation. 90 minutes total, assuming perfect conditions and no mechanical issues. Captain Hiroshi Matsubara of the carrier Zuikaku had written extensively about American carrier operations in his tactical analysis reports sent to Combined Fleet Headquarters. His assessment, based on intelligence gathered from observation and prisoner interrogations, concluded that American carriers followed similar launch procedures to Japanese carriers, perhaps with slightly less efficiency due to their less experienced crews. June 1944 stated with confidence, American carrier launch operations remain consistent with universal naval aviation doctrine. Their advantage lies solely in numerical superiority of hulls, not operational innovation. Every assumption was wrong. What the Japanese naval intelligence had failed to understand, what their carrier commanders could not have anticipated, was that the United States Navy had fundamentally reimagined the physics and logistics of carrier flight operations. The Essex-class design incorporated innovations that transformed launch procedures from sequential operations into nearly simultaneous ones. The deck configuration was the first revolution. Unlike Japanese carriers with centerline elevators that blocked flight operations during aircraft movement, Essex-class carriers used deck-edge elevators positioned on the starboard side. Two massive hydraulic platforms could lift fully loaded and fueled aircraft from hangar to flight deck in under 60 seconds, and critically, could operate simultaneously while aircraft were launching from the bow. This single design innovation eliminated the 30-minute deck preparation period that Japanese doctrine considered immutable. Lieutenant Commander Thomas Blackburn, Air Group Commander aboard USS Bunker Hill, had perfected the rapid launch procedure through months of intensive training. His technique, adopted across the Essex-class fleet, used what American aviators called the deck pack. Instead of bringing aircraft up sequentially and positioning them for launch, the entire strike package was pre-positioned on deck in precise patterns that allowed simultaneous engine starts and taxi operations. The morning of October 24th found Bunker Hill's flight deck loaded with 93 aircraft, 36 Hellcat fighters positioned forward and along the starboard deck edge, 32 Helldiver dive bombers in two ranks along the port side, 25 Avenger torpedo bombers aft, their wings already spread and locked. Every aircraft was fueled, armed, and had been pre-flighted during the 30 minutes before dawn. At 0600 hours, Blackburn received the execute order from Admiral Frederick Sherman, commanding Task Group 38.3. The flag signal snapped up the halyards. Launch all aircraft. What followed was orchestrated chaos that would have seemed like dangerous madness to any Japanese observer. At 0601, deck crews pulled wheel chocks simultaneously from the first rank of Hellcats. 6 aircraft, their engines already warming, began rolling forward in a staggered line toward the bow. The interval between launches compressed to 15 seconds. Hellcat number 1 rolled over the bow at 0602. Number 2 followed at 0602 and 15 seconds. The acceleration from start to airborne required exactly 270 feet of flight deck and 4 seconds from brake release to bow crossing. While the first Hellcat was still visible climbing away from the ship, the deck-edge elevators were already lifting the next wave. 8 Helldivers rose from the hangar deck, emerging topside at 0603. Deck crews, choreographed through hundreds of practice evolutions, manually pushed the aircraft forward as soon as the elevator locked into position. No time was wasted taxiing under aircraft power. Muscle and precision positioning replaced mechanical movement. Aviation Ordnanceman Second Class. Robert Mitchell worked in Controlled Fury, his crew responsible for the starboard bow section. Each Hellcat in his section carried one 500-pound general-purpose bomb on the centerline rack and 6 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rockets on wing rails. Total ordnance weight, 840 pounds per aircraft, well within the Hellcat's 3,000-pound maximum load. His team's job was to ensure that every aircraft cleared the deck without a single malfunction that might block subsequent launches. Clear prop! The shout repeated across the flight deck as 36 engines reached operating temperature simultaneously. The noise was overwhelming, a physical force that made communication impossible except through hand signals and the disciplined choreography that every deck crew had burned into muscle memory through endless repetitions. At 0604, 12 Hellcats were airborne and climbing. The next rank of dive bombers was already rolling. At 0605, the first Avenger torpedo bombers began their launch sequence from the aft deck. The launch officer, positioned on a platform with clear sight lines across the entire deck, directed traffic with colored paddles that every pilot could see regardless of their position. The procedure that Japanese doctrine said required 90 minutes was being completed in its 8th minute. At 0608, the last Avenger cleared the deck, its torpedo-laden belly dropping slightly before the right cyclone engine pulled it into a climb. Bunker Hill's deck was empty, except for deck crews already preparing for the next evolution, recovery of the combat air patrol that had been flying protective circles overhead. 93 aircraft launched in 7 minutes and 42 seconds. The impossible had become routine. The technology enabling this revolution extended beyond deck configuration. American carrier aircraft had been designed specifically for rapid launch operations. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat featured wide-track landing gear that provided exceptional stability during deck operations and eliminated the careful positioning required by narrow-gear Japanese fighters. Hydraulically operated wings could be spread and locked in 12 seconds, compared to the manual folding systems on Japanese aircraft that required 2 to 3 minutes per plane. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Engine starting procedures had been similarly revolutionized. The Pratt & Whitney R2-800 double Wasp engines in Hellcats used electric starters that brought engines to operating temperature in under 60 seconds. Japanese aircraft still relied primarily on manual inertia starters, requiring deck crews to physically spin a flywheel before engaging the engine, a process requiring 3 to 4 minutes per aircraft. Even fuel systems reflected American innovation. Essex-class carriers used a closed aviation fuel system with pressurized delivery that could refuel 6 aircraft simultaneously in under 10 minutes. Japanese carriers relied on gravity-fed systems requiring careful monitoring and individual attention to each aircraft, consuming precious minutes during pre-launch operations. Commander Nakamura, still watching from Myoko's bridge as the American strike bore down on Admiral Kurita's center force, finally understood what he was witnessing. This was not a single carrier's strike package, though even that reality would have been shocking enough. This was a coordinated launch from multiple carriers, each apparently capable of putting a full air group aloft in the time Japanese doctrine required just to prepare the deck. His radio intercept operators had identified 6 different American carrier call signs directing aircraft. Task Group 38.3 under Admiral Sherman, Lexington, Bunker Hill, and Essex. Task Group 38.2 under Admiral Bogan, Intrepid, Cabot, and Independence. The plot board showed over 200 aircraft converging on the center force's position. The mathematical reality was inescapable. The Americans had launched this armada in less than 10 minutes from initial execution order to the last aircraft airborne. The tactical implications of 8-minute launch capability were transforming naval warfare in ways that Japanese commanders were only beginning to comprehend. Traditional carrier doctrine held that a carrier was most vulnerable during launch and recovery operations, when aircraft crowded the deck and maneuvering was restricted. The 90-minute launch window created a period of maximum exposure, during which an enemy could locate and attack the launching carrier. Essex-class carriers had compressed this vulnerability window to less than 10 minutes. More critically, they could execute multiple launch cycles per day, where Japanese carriers could manage only 2 or 3. The operational mathematics were devastating. An Essex-class carrier conducting 4 launch cycles in a 12-hour operational period could put 360 sorties into the air. A Japanese fleet carrier managing 3 launches in the same period would achieve 240 sorties at absolute maximum, and that assumed no combat damage, no mechanical issues, and perfectly trained crews. Lieutenant Masao Yamada, senior air officer aboard the carrier Zuikaku, had witnessed American carrier operations firsthand during the Battle of the Philippine Sea 4 months earlier. His after-action report, one of the few honest assessments to reach combined fleet headquarters, detailed observations that should have shocked the Naval General Staff into recognition of American superiority. On June 19, 1944, we observed American carrier formations launching what appeared to be their entire air groups in rapid succession. Initial estimates suggested 3 to 4 carriers were conducting simultaneous launches. Subsequent intelligence indicates we observed a single carrier task group executing coordinated rapid launch procedures. American aircraft appeared over our fleet in waves with intervals of only 10 to 15 minutes between major strikes. Our own doctrine would require 45 to 60 minutes between launches of equivalent scale. His report concluded with a sentence that summarized the futility of Japanese resistance. "We cannot match American launch tempo with current carrier designs and procedures." Numerical inferiority in carriers is compounded by operational inferiority in launch capability, creating a combined disadvantage of approximately 4-1 in daily sortie generation. The report was filed and largely ignored. The possibility that American carriers had achieved such fundamental superiority was too psychologically threatening to accept. The reality was more devastating than even Lieutenant Yamada had calculated. By October 1944, the United States Navy had 14 Essex-class carriers operational in the Pacific. Each carrier could generate 90 to 100 sorties per launch cycle and conduct 4 cycles per operational day. The mathematics produced a theoretical maximum of 5,600 sorties daily from Essex-class carriers alone, not counting light carriers and escort carriers that brought the total American carrier strength to over 100 flight decks. The Imperial Japanese Navy, by contrast, had 4 operational carriers remaining: Zuikaku, Zuiho, Chitose, and Chiyoda. Combined air groups totaled 116 aircraft, many piloted by partially trained aviators with fewer than 50 flight hours. Even if Japanese carriers could match American launch tempo, which they could not, the sortie generation capacity was less than 200 aircraft per day across the entire remaining carrier force. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, commanding the Japanese carrier force designated as decoy bait for the Leyte Gulf operation, understood these mathematics precisely. His mission was not to win, which was impossible, but to draw American carriers away from the landing beaches so that Admiral Kurita's battleships could reach the invasion fleet. He would sacrifice his carriers, his aircraft, and his men to create a tactical opportunity that might, if fortune smiled impossibly bright, allow Japan a few more months of resistance. On the morning of October 25th, Ozawa's carriers launched their strikes knowing that most aircraft would not return, not because of combat losses, though those were certain, but because the carriers launching them would be sunk before the aircraft could return. The disparity between Japanese desperation and American operational confidence was absolute. USS Essex, the named ship of her class, demonstrated the full scope of American carrier capability during the Leyte Gulf operations. Captain Carlos Wilfred Crommelin commanded a crew of 3,000 men operating what was effectively a floating city dedicated to a single purpose: projecting air power at ranges and scales the Japanese could no longer match. The morning launch on October 25th began at 05:45. Crommelin's air group commander had briefed a maximum effort strike against Ozawa's carrier force, detected 280 miles to the northeast. The tactical problem was straightforward: launch the maximum possible strike, maintain sufficient combat air patrol for fleet defense, and execute rapid recovery of returning aircraft before fuel exhaustion forced ditching. Air Officer Lieutenant Commander Robert Johnson had planned the launch sequence with mechanical precision. First wave, 36 Hellcats configured for fighter sweep to suppress Japanese combat air patrol. These aircraft, carrying only ammunition and minimal fuel load, would launch first and proceed at maximum speed to clear enemy fighters before the vulnerable dive bombers and torpedo planes arrived. Second wave, 32 Helldivers carrying 1,000-pound armor-piercing bombs. These aircraft, heavily loaded, required longer takeoff runs and would launch immediately after the fighters cleared the deck. Third wave, 24 Avengers carrying Mark 13 torpedoes, each weapon weighing 2,000 pounds and capable of breaking a carrier's keel with a single hit below the waterline. Total strike package, 92 aircraft. Launch time from first fighter to last torpedo bomber, 7 minutes, 18 seconds. At 05:45, the flag signal dropped and the first Hellcat rolled. The choreography was perfect. Deck crews moved like dancers, each man knowing his position, his timing, his role in the mechanism that transformed a steel flight deck into a launching platform for American air power. Yellow shirts directed aircraft movement. Red shirts handled ordnance. Blue shirts choked and chained aircraft. Purple shirts fueled planes. Green shirts operated catapults and arresting gear. Each colored jersey represented specialized training and absolute competence. The deck edge elevators worked continuously. As fighters launched forward, dive bombers rose from the hangar deck aft, The geometric precision of aircraft positioning meant that each plane had a clear taxi path to the launch position. No time was wasted repositioning or waiting for deck space to clear. Aviation machinist mate first class Donald Chen watched from his position near the island superstructure, monitoring engine performance as aircraft after aircraft roared past. His job was to identify any engine running rough, any aircraft showing mechanical issues that might cause a deck crash. In 7 minutes of continuous launches, not a single aircraft showed problems. The maintenance standards on Essex were absolute. At 0552, the last Avenger cleared the deck. Johnson immediately ordered the deck reconfigured for recovery operations. Deck crews moved the crash barriers into position. The landing signal officer took his station on the port side aft, paddles ready. Medical teams positioned themselves near the island, ready for the injuries that inevitably accompanied carrier operations even in peacetime conditions. The entire evolution from first launch to recovery-ready configuration required 14 minutes. Essex was ready to receive returning aircraft by 0606, a full cycle time that Japanese carriers required 90 minutes to complete. What made this operational tempo sustainable was the maintenance philosophy embedded in Essex-class operations. Japanese carriers operated with minimal spare parts, limited maintenance facilities, and a philosophy that emphasized keeping maximum aircraft operational at all times, even at the cost of deferred maintenance that led to higher long-term failure rates. Essex-class carriers carried complete spare engines, propellers, and major components. Each ship had machine shops capable of manufacturing replacement parts. Maintenance crews worked in shifts around the clock, ensuring that aircraft were fully serviced between sorties. The American philosophy accepted slightly lower immediate aircraft availability in exchange for sustained high-tempo operations over weeks and months. The results were measurable. Japanese carrier air groups by October 1944 were achieving approximately 60% aircraft availability rates due to accumulated maintenance issues and lack of spare parts. Essex-class carriers maintained 80 to 85% availability, despite conducting twice as many sorties per day. Commander Nakamura, still observing from Miyoko's bridge as American aircraft began their attack runs on the center force, watched dive bombers fall from the sky in precisely timed sequences. The attacks came in waves, each separated by only minutes. His plotting board showed continuous American aircraft overhead for the next 6 hours. The center force was under constant assault with no respite, no time to maneuver, no opportunity to reorganize. The super battleship Musashi, pride of the Imperial Navy with her 18-inch guns and armor belt impervious to any projectile, began taking hits. 1 torpedo, 2, 5, 10. The mathematically impossible continued. 19 torpedoes and 17 bombs would strike Musashi before she sank, an accumulation of damage that only continuous air attacks from multiple carriers could deliver. The American strike aircraft attacking Musashi came from 7 different carriers: Essex, Lexington, Enterprise, Franklin, Intrepid, Cabot, and Independence. The coordinated attack represented a combination of Essex-class fleet carriers and Independence-class light carriers, operating as a seamless, striking force. The launch tempo from multiple carriers created overlapping waves of aircraft that gave Japanese defenders no respite. At 13:30 hours, Musashi's captain ordered the abandoned ship, the massive vessel, 69,000 tons of steel that embodied Japanese naval power, rolled to port and sank, taking over 1,000 men with her. The ship's destruction required an accumulation of ordnance that would have exhausted any Japanese carrier force for days. The American carriers had delivered it in 6 hours of continuous strikes and still had sufficient aircraft and ordnance for evening attacks. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Admiral Kurita, commanding the center force, faced an impossible calculation. His force was under continuous air attack. His air cover consisted of a handful of land-based fighters that were being systematically destroyed. No Japanese carriers were available to provide support because Ozawa's force was itself under devastating attack 300 miles to the north. The tactical situation revealed the strategic bankruptcy of Japanese naval doctrine. Split the fleet, divide forces, hope that superior fighting spirit and tactical excellence could overcome material disadvantage. The center force had divided from Ozawa's carriers, which had divided from land-based air support, creating 3 separate forces, each too weak to defend themselves against concentrated American carrier strikes. Meanwhile, 300 miles northeast, Admiral Ozawa's carrier force was experiencing the full fury of American carrier air power. At 0800 hours, search aircraft from USS Essex had located the Japanese carriers. Admiral William Halsey, commanding 3rd Fleet, ordered immediate strikes from every available carrier. The launch evolution that followed demonstrated the full scope of Essex-class operational dominance. 9 carriers launched strikes between 0830 and 0845. Over 200 aircraft were airborne and proceeded to the target in 15 minutes. The sorties included fighters for fleet air defense, replacement combat air patrol, anti-submarine patrol, and the strike packages heading for Ozawa's carriers. Lieutenant Commander Robert Weatherholt led Lexington's strike group. His tactical briefing had identified 4 Japanese carriers, Zuikaku, Zuiho, Chitose, and Chiyoda. Intelligence estimated total defensive capability at perhaps 50 fighters and moderate anti-aircraft fire. The American strike consisted of 67 aircraft from Lexington alone, with additional strikes from Essex and Ticonderoga arriving within minutes. At 10 to 100 hours, Weatherholt's strike reached the Japanese carriers. The defensive response was anemic. Fewer than 20 Japanese fighters rose to intercept, most flown by inexperienced pilots who were quickly overwhelmed by the escorting Hellcats. Anti-aircraft fire was scattered and ineffective. The Japanese carriers, designed for offensive operations, had minimal defensive armament compared to the bristling anti-aircraft batteries on Essex-class ships. Zuikaku, the last surviving carrier from the Pearl Harbor attack force, took multiple bomb and torpedo hits. The veteran carrier that had participated in every major engagement of the Pacific War began listing immediately. Her crew, knowing this was the end, worked with desperate courage to save their ship even as fires consumed the hangar deck. Chitose and Chiyoda, light carriers converted from seaplane tenders, lasted barely minutes under the concentrated assault. Neither ship had armor sufficient to resist 1,000-pound bombs. Both broke apart and sank with heavy loss of life. Zuiho, the last carrier remaining, attempted to escape while her sister ships burned. A second American strike wave arrived at 1100 hours, aircraft from Essex and Enterprise. Zuiho took 4 torpedo hits and capsized within 20 minutes. In 3 hours, American carriers had eliminated the last operational carriers of the Imperial Japanese Navy. The sortie tempo that made this possible was unprecedented in naval history. Essex-class carriers were already preparing 3rd and 4th strike waves when word arrived that no targets remained. The human cost of Japan's technological and operational inferiority was catastrophic. Zuikaku sank with 843 crew members. Chitose took with her 900 men. Chiyoda lost 585 sailors. Zuiho's crew suffered 415 dead. Over 2,600 Japanese sailors died that day, many trapped in compartments below decks as their carriers capsized. American losses in the strikes against Ozawa's carriers totaled 16 aircraft, mostly to operational accidents and fuel exhaustion rather than enemy action. The exchange ratio was absolute. 4 carriers sunk for 16 aircraft lost. The operational tempo that enabled this victory continued without pause. By 1400 hours, Essex was recovering her strike aircraft, refueling and rearming them, and preparing for evening anti-submarine patrols. The deck that had launched 92 aircraft at dawn was ready to launch again before sunset. Daily sortie counts for October 25th showed Essex generating 118 sorties, from dawn fighter sweeps to dusk combat air patrol. No Japanese carrier had ever achieved triple-digit daily sortie counts. The operational impossibility had become an American routine. Lieutenant Yamada, aboard the doomed Zuikaku, survived the sinking and would spend weeks floating in the Philippine Sea before being rescued by an American submarine. His post-war testimony provided a Japanese perspective on the technological gulf. "We trained to be the best carrier aviators in the world. Our doctrine emphasized skill, courage, and tactical excellence. What we faced at Leyte Gulf was not better pilots or superior tactics. We faced an industrial and operational system that made our expertise irrelevant. They launched more aircraft in 8 minutes than we could launch in 2 hours. They could do it 4 times a day, every day, from 14 carriers, while we struggled to maintain 4 carriers total. The war was lost not because we lacked courage, but because we were fighting 19th century warfare against an enemy who had perfected 20th century industrial warfare." The technological innovations that enabled 8-minute launches extended beyond visible deck operations. Essex-class carriers used hydraulic catapults to assist takeoff, reducing required deck run and allowing heavier ordnance loads. While not essential for routine launches in calm seas, the catapults proved critical during operations in heavy weather or when launching heavily loaded aircraft. Fire suppression systems aboard Essex-class carriers represented another dimension of operational superiority. Sprinkler systems in hangar decks, fire curtains that could section off damaged areas, and damage control parties trained to contain blazes within minutes meant that the catastrophic fires that destroyed Japanese carriers at Midway were far less likely to occur aboard American ships. The October 25th combat proved this repeatedly. USS Franklin took a bomb hit that would have doomed any Japanese carrier. The fire was contained in 18 minutes. The ship resumed flight operations within 2 hours. USS Belleau Wood suffered a kamikaze strike that killed 92 men. Damage control teams had fires out in 35 minutes. The carrier launched strikes the following morning. Japanese carriers, designed for offensive operations with minimal defensive architecture, had no equivalent damage control capability. A single bomb hit could trigger fires that consumed the entire ship. The destruction of Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu at Midway had demonstrated this vulnerability. Nothing had changed in the intervening 2 years because Japanese doctrine still emphasized offense over resilience. By nightfall on October 25th, the operational statistics told the story of complete American dominance. Essex-class carriers had launched over 800 sorties during daylight hours. They had sunk 4 Japanese carriers, 1 battleship, 3 cruisers, and multiple destroyers. American aircraft losses totaled 67 planes, with 43 pilots rescued. The sustained operational tempo had been unmatched in naval history. Admiral Halsey's report to Admiral Chester Nimitz summarized the day. The rapid launch capability of Essex-class carriers enabled continuous strikes that gave the enemy no opportunity to recover or reorganize. We maintained aircraft over enemy forces from dawn to dusk, a feat impossible with conventional carrier launch procedures. This operational advantage proved as decisive as numerical superiority in hulls. The implications extended beyond tactical victory. The 8-minute launch capability meant that American carriers could respond to threats or opportunities instantly. Japanese carriers requiring 90 minutes to launch meant enemy forces had extensive warning time to maneuver or escape. The compressed American launch window created tactical surprise that multiplied the effectiveness of every strike. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.